Hi everyone, so I'm Dave Patrick with the Conservation by Design team here from our Chief Conservation Office. And in this presentation today, I'd like to introduce you to intermediate results as a key component of our conservation strategies. Now, if you're really familiar with intermediate results already, if your team is using them, you've got strong intermediate results as a basis for adaptive management, then I'd encourage you to skip this presentation. You probably know what I'm going to cover already. If, on the other hand, you're looking to develop intermediate results for the first time or improve existing intermediate results, you want to set yourselves up for using them as a basis for adaptive management, and you're not sure about the best way to go about doing that, then I really do encourage you to listen through to the end, because I'll offer some specific guidance around where you can get help in meeting those needs. So in terms of what I'm going to cover today, I want to begin by putting intermediate results into the larger context of adaptive management, talking about sort of the planning part of developing and implementing our strategies. And then from there, I'm going to zoom in and talk about our conservation by design modules. And these are where you can get specific help in that process of developing, improving, and setting yourselves up for tracking those intermediate results. And because that guidance is covered in those modules, what I'm not going to be doing today is getting into the details of how you sort of identify if you've got strong intermediate results, how you might prioritize among sort of multiple options to pursue. That content is covered in those conservation by design modules, so I'll point you towards those resources. Once you have intermediate results, I want to emphasize now, and I'll come back to this again, just having them on paper is only the beginning of their value. That value is realized when you actually start to gather data relating to those intermediate results and use that as a basis for adaptive management. So having a monitoring, evaluation, and learning plan and implementing that plan is absolutely key. So mentioning that here, and again, I will come back and re-emphasize that at the end as I wrap up with a few kind of closing remarks. So along the way, I thought it might be helpful to have a case study to illustrate some of the concepts that I'll be talking about. And the New Hampshire team here in the Northeastern United States was kind enough to agree for me to use the Great Bay Estuary, restoration of the Great Bay Estuary, as the basis for this case study. Now, I do want to emphasize that this is a complex strategy, as most of our strategies are. It has lots of different facets and elements to it, and I simply can't do that story justice in this brief presentation today. So as I use the case study, please see it as me sort of just using it to illustrate concepts, not as an accurate depiction of the strategy as a whole. Now, that said, I do want to give you enough of a quick background context here at the beginning that when I do use it as to illustrate concepts, you can kind of follow along with the story here. So in terms of the goals of the team as they look to restore the Great Bay Estuary, it really is around protecting and increasing the resilience of critical habitat and ecosystem function in New Hampshire's coastal watersheds. Great Bay Estuary is a central part, a key part of the overall coastal watershed. It's also focused on working with and supporting community leaders to enhance the benefits of nature for human well-being and adapting to climate change. So as you think about the 17 metrics that make up our 2030 goals, you'll be able to see that this strategy has clear alignment in helping to contribute towards those goals. So the Great Bay Estuary is incredibly important for both biodiversity and for people as are estuaries worldwide. It's an incredibly productive system. It serves as a nursery ground for fish. It's a place that's really important for people living in the area for recreation, for commercial purposes. Great Bay is such an important part of New Hampshire's coastal economy, coastal community, both natural and the human elements of that community. And as is the case with many estuaries across the world, it has been significantly degraded through human activities. And that includes changes we've made to the land, changes we've made to the fresh water that flows into the estuary, direct impacts on the estuary itself, and changes in the marine environment. Our estuaries are so sensitive because changes in all of those different ecosystems touch down and affect the estuary. So restoration of this estuary has a huge potential then to restore critical habitat for biodiversity, and also to really help people in the area sort of realize the full potential of the estuary for the first time in decades. So I'll be coming back to Great Bay along the way here then, but wanted to offer you that brief kind of overview so you understood the context. So let's begin then with sort of that, putting intermediate results into that larger context of adaptive management. And what I want to emphasize here is sort of what are some useful mental models as you think about kind of strategy planning in general that can help you kind of right size your investment of resources in the planning process. How do intermediate results kind of fit into that mix, and why should you care? Why should you prioritize putting resources towards developing, tracking, and adaptively managing using intermediate results? So we'll start then with sort of thinking about strategy planning here. And when I mean talk about strategy planning, what I'm thinking about is any time that a group of individuals, typically that's a team from the Nature Conservancy, often with interested parties directly engaged, Anytime a group sits down, they've got a complex challenge they're looking to solve in service of achieving our 2030 goals, and we ask ourselves some version of the question, what should we do? Given all the things we could do, given the challenges we're looking to solve, how do we use our available resources, which are always limited, as effectively as possible, and giving us the greatest likelihood that we'll see the change that we want to drive in the world? So we typically imagine having those conversations at the beginning of a new initiative and of a new strategy. And obviously that is a really important time to sit down and go through a strategy planning exercise. But the reality, and in fact the necessity, is that you should be revisiting the elements of that strategy plan throughout the lifespan of a strategy. And the reason for that is that things will not go exactly according to plan. We'll have some great ideas out of the gate. Some of those will play out as we hope they might, and some of them won't. And we need to harness that learning and use it to adapt our strategy. So the key take-home message then at this point of my presentation is that when we think about strategy planning, it's not a one and done exercise. Planning should inform implementation, which should feed learning back into the strategy plan. And that is that adaptive management cycle. It should go on continuously through the lifespan of a strategy. And the reason that that's so important is that, it is really easy when you sit down to go through a strategy planning exercise, and I've certainly been sort of guilty of this myself, as seeing it as exactly predicting the future. If we can just get together enough people, if we can gather enough evidence from the scientific literature and traditional knowledge and local communities and partners, and bring all of that together, we can exactly determine what we should do from this point to achieve the success we want to see in the strategy. And it's kind of like when you put in a route into like Google Maps or something similar to that, you get an exact route that tells you where to go. And because of that, we can and often do invest a tremendous amount of time in those initial strategy planning exercises. It can be over a year sometimes for teams going through this. But the challenge and the reality is that, as anyone who's actually sort of taken strategy plans out into the world knows, is that things never play out exactly as we expect them to, because while we have control over the actions we take, we have little to no control around the context within which those actions play out. And those contexts are highly uncertain, they change all the time. What this means is that many of the actions, despite having strong evidence when we start with them, many of those actions aren't going to play out the way we expect them to. And in fact, often the forces that determine the success or failures of our strategies are seemingly chance events, things we simply couldn't predict. It could be that that chance encounter with a partner at a scientific meeting. It could be that new funding source coming online or that key funding source going away. It could be that a change in the political makeup of a group that we need to work with. These kinds of events are actually the norm rather than the exception in determining the success of our strategies. Which might beg sort of a pretty reasonable question. If the success of our actions is so prone, and open to chance, why bother having any kind of strategy plans at all? Why spend resources on these kinds of conversations? Well, the reality is that at any point in time, we do actually have a lot of knowledge that we can draw from that can help us sort of hone in on the best suite of actions for us to take, for that next step going forward. We know a lot. Typically teams working on our strategies have done this kind of work, sometimes in the same place, certainly in other systems as well. We have a lot of evidence from traditional knowledge, from the scientific literature, from local communities that can point us in the right directions. So we do have a lot of information to go on. And, if we are being very deliberate about learning along the way, we're not just going to be reliant on sort of, what we know from the world in general in terms of evidence. We're going to be actually gathering evidence and learning from the specific actions we're taking in the specific context within which we want to drive change. So that learning, as long as we're being deliberate, can actually help us increase our confidence throughout the lifespan of a strategy that we are on track to achieve the outcomes we want to see. So this then sort of, what I've shared so far really reflects a balancing act that our teams, should have in mind as we step into any sort of strategy planning conversation, which is sort of a balance between wanting to harness the best available evidence, wanting to really hone in on what, actions we think are solidly grounded in evidence, give us the most likelihood of being successful, and at the same time, recognizing that the success of those actions will depend upon chance events out in those contexts that we don't have control over. And so we want to make sure that we right size our investment of resources in planning, and as much as we possibly can, really step into the space of implementation with that adaptive management mindset, because that will be key for us in reducing that uncertainty, increasing our confidence through the lifespan of a strategy. So let me use sort of an example of this then from the Great Bay Estuary. So in the case of Great Bay, when the team thought about restoring the estuary itself, they immediately honed in on restoring shellfish beds. In this case, it's oyster reefs. They used to be widespread throughout the Great Bay Estuary. Oysters are a really important habitat for juvenile fish. They clean the water. They're an important resource for people as well. They serve any number of different functions. So if we could restore those oyster reefs back to the bay, then we could really kind of catalyze restoration of that system as a whole. And we know a lot. The world knows a lot about how to restore oyster reefs. There are practitioners globally who have been focused on this. They've gathered a huge amount of learning. And so the team, when they sat down, when I joined New Hampshire in 2015, they'd already honed in on an approach that was based in really solid evidence. And that approach is what we call spat-on shell. What you do is you take clean oyster shells, put them in a big saltwater tank with a bunch of oyster larvae. The larvae start to grow on the shells, and then you put those oyster shells with the baby oysters over the side of a boat onto a bed of clean clam shells you've already deployed as a substrate. Then the idea is that those oysters grow to maturity and they kickstart the restoration of that system. So the team had a lot of information about how to go through that restoration exercise. And what they also had in mind then was was a cause and effect logic of, if we do this thing, if we restore oysters in this way, it should, through a series of logical events, then lead to the success that the team wanted to see. Now, I do want to emphasize the 60 hectares of estuary with improved management here. 60 hectares is my number. It's not a number that the team directly provide to me. It's just for illustrative purposes. So we have this cause and effect logic baked into the actions that we're looking to take. So let's zoom in now and sort of think about how intermediate results specifically fit into that need for sort of strategy planning and adaptive management. So useful intermediate results can help us to test key assumptions. So we go back to that, that domino sort of logic that I showed in the previous slide. What we have there is a story where, if we take these actions, it will lead to this change happening, which will lead to this change happening. We call that story a results chain. And in that results chain, there are a bunch of assumptions. Yeah, a bunch of things that we sort of have to be true in order for that logic to play out the way that we want it to. And intermediate results can help us to test the most important assumptions. And generally, those are assumptions where, if the assumption is not valid, it really is likely to make it much harder to achieve the outcome we want to see. So it matters. And we're not really sure if that assumption is valid. We don't have a lot of really strong evidence to give us confidence in the assumption today. So those are the kinds of intermediate results that we want to hone in on, because they will sort of play the most important roles in helping to either increase our confidence that we're on the right track to achieve the outcomes we want to see, or tell us when the approaches we're taking are not playing out as we expected them to. And that can mean sort of a slight adjust. It can mean a major adjust. And sometimes it can mean that we decide that we actually don't see any path to success with solving this particular challenge, and we should put our resources to bear elsewhere, in places where we can see the opportunities for impact at scale. Now, when we think about intermediate results, they can and often are spread through the lifespan of our strategies, but I wanted to emphasize sort of 2 points in that timeline that might be particularly helpful for you to think about as you prioritize developing intermediate results. And those are sort of the beginning and at the end of the strategy, depending upon sort of where you are as a team. So even if you're halfway through the strategy, then that sort of start point is that halfway mark, yeah. So the first sort of group here then is near-term intermediate results, and these are really sort of, it's all in the name, yeah. They can help you figure out, once you've honed in on that suite of actions you think are going to be most effective, they can help you really quickly learn whether or not those actions are playing out as expected, whether or not those assumptions are valid. On the other end of the spectrum, we have sort of long-term intermediate results. Those are typically sort of, achieved later on, closer to the end of our strategy. And they sort of serve the opposite purpose. And I think about this as if you're like driving a boat across a large body of water, keeping an eye on something on the other side of the lake or the estuary or the bay can help you make sure that you stay on track. They can help you make sure that no matter what path you might wind, you don't lose sight of where you're going. So let's dig in a little bit deeper on those two cases, and again use Great Bay as an example of these contexts. So the first then is our near-term intermediate results, and I like to think of these as sort of driving down a windy road at night, as the road kind of reveals itself as you come around each corner. And the way to think about these is sort of, given what we know today, what seems like the next best step to take, the next best actions we can take, and then how can we really learn quickly if those actions are playing out as we hope they will. Because as I've emphasized already, almost nothing goes according to plan. And those near-term intermediate results, if we're careful in choosing them and make sure we actually gather the data to assess them, can help us to be really deliberate about learning. We cannot gather data on everything. We need to focus our learning agendas. And then once we've gone through that first phase, we learned about those initial actions. Some of them may play out as we expect. Some of them might suggest that we need to adjust. And at that point, we can go back to our strategies, revise the elements we need to, and say, okay, now what are the next suite of near-term intermediate results will help us kind of step forward with our adaptive management process. So let's go back to Great Bay to sort of illustrate this. So again, the approach here that the team had in mind was this spat on shell approach. And a key assumption there was that when you put the baby oysters over the side of the boat, they survive to maturity. They produce larvae of their own. And so the team wanted a way for actually assessing that. The number here of 10% is my number, it's not the team's number. But they decided on a threshold of 10%, well, I decided on a threshold of 10% as sort of a good marker of like, if we achieve this threshold, we have enough survival that we can be pretty confident that they're going to begin to produce larvae. Yeah. So team went back that next year. I was part of this effort, gathered data on those restoration sites, and they found very low survival. Yeah. Indicating that this assumption was not sort of valid in its simple form. What they also found though was that where they'd accidentally mounded up the oyster shells, there was much higher survival. So not only did they test this key assumption and in this case invalidate it, but they gathered learning to help them sort of direct their improvements to the actions going forward. So I mentioned sort of the other end of the spectrum, then we have these long-term intermediate results. And for many strategies, there are often kind of some key things that need to be in place in order for your outcomes to be achieved. These can be like that major policy win that's at the center of the heart of that strategy's success. It can be that dramatic increase in funding that really enables the team to do things that they plan to do. If the strategy is based on sharing tools and resources through a network of partners, it can be the development and successful testing of those tools. So typically, again, there are often a small number of things that have to be in place. No matter what path we might take in sort of near-term intermediate results and adaptive management, we have to hit those endpoints in order for us to achieve our outcomes. And so long-term intermediate results, then, as the name suggests, they're often not things we can actually sort of validate until we get much closer to the end of our strategy, but they can serve two really important needs. So the first is sort of mentioned already, helping us to stay on course, not lose sight of the goals we have to achieve as we adaptively manage on sort of a more near-term basis. The other is that they can give us a lot of confidence in our outcomes. So that if we achieve those long-term intermediate results, if we meet all of them, even if we haven't actually sort of seen the change in the world that we want to see yet, we aren't able to measure progress towards our outcomes, we can have a lot more confidence that we're going to do so. And that's really powerful for the team. It's also really powerful for our organization as a whole, having that knowledge in mind. So going back to Great Bay, let's talk about an example of a long-term intermediate result. So in the case of this team, figuring out how to successfully restore sort of oyster through direct T&C action was only the first step in the process. We knew we couldn't get to scale through those approaches alone. What we needed to do was we needed to develop best management practices. That's what's meant by BMPs in the purple box here, that we could then share with key partners. And in this case, our key partners were oyster farmers. There's a network of oyster farmers in the estuary. If we could get them to adopt our best management practices, we could scale our restoration efforts. So again, the team, in this case myself, generated some thresholds and numbers for what that success would look like. In this case, 10 farmers using the Nature Conservancy's best management practices, over 40 hectares of oyster aquaculture by 2028. And so that was sort of that longer term intermediate result. In this case, an example of one that if the team achieved this, they'd have a lot more confidence they were on the right track to achieving their outcomes. Okay, so we talked about the larger context of adaptive management. We've zoomed in and talked about intermediate results. Now, how do you actually get help in developing, improving, and implementing these? I am assuming at this point in the presentation that you have some familiarity with how we've approached updating conservation by design, the Nature Conservancy's guidance for supporting teams in developing and improving our conservation strategies. So just we're coming to the end of a 3-year effort to update that guidance. If that's not familiar story to you, really encourage you to check out our new website where you can find information about the approach we took, why we took that approach, and the kinds of resources that are available. So I'm going to move forward with an assumption that you have that knowledge in mind. And if you do, you'll know that we took what we call a modular approach. So we broke the key steps in developing a conservation strategies down into a series of standalone modules, tools, resources, guidance, and teams can sort of move among these modules in whatever order that they might want to. Now, there are 2 of the modules, our theory of change and our monitoring, evaluation, and learning modules that provide specific support with intermediate results. And so I'm going to jump in and talk a little bit more about those 2 here in just a moment. Now, that said, even though these modules are standalone, meaning you don't have to go through preceding modules in order to be able to jump into a module, What you will find when you read the guidance for these modules is there's what we call a readiness checklist. And this is important for modules like the theory of change that typically come later in the process, because if your team is just getting started, it's very difficult for you to have sort of all of the building blocks in place to jump into a theory of change. And we really encourage you to check out some of our other modules beforehand to build that foundation. Because in simple terms, the quality of your theory of change will determine the quality and the value of your intermediate results. So if you jump straight into the theory of change and it's in a really simple form to begin with, you can expect to have to do a lot more work to develop those useful intermediate results. So let's dig in a little bit deeper then and talk about the theory of change and then the monitoring, evaluation, and learning modules. So I want to begin by sort of giving you a sense of what you might expect when you go through a theory of change module. One thing I should say is that for all of our modules, we have found that dedicated facilitation, somebody who's been trained as a facilitator for this module, is helpful. And so we have resources available to train facilitators in the modules if those aren't already present within your team, within your division in North America or your region elsewhere. So when you step into a theory of change, what you should expect, working with your facilitator then, is usually it's broken down into 3 sessions, each somewhere between 3 and 4 hours long. So this is an investment of time and resources. I would also emphasize that a theory of change is an absolutely critical element of a strong strategy informing effective adaptive management. As we've updated Conservation by Design, we have aimed to be efficient and effective through these modules. So this is actually a fraction of the time teams would typically take to develop a theory of change. But still, we recognize that 9 to 12 hours is an investment of time and resources. And as you go through a theory of change, coming out the other end, you should expect of a first draft of a theory of change, not a perfect version. And there really is no such thing. Again, we talked about, already about chance, the context within which our actions touch down. So even if we could develop a theory of change that was perfect in any given moment, over time it will become less relevant because of what is changing in the larger world within which we're taking those actions. So we shouldn't think about it as perfect, and we should think about it really then as serving as a foundation for continuous learning through adaptive management, where we over time are adjusting our theory of change to reflect what we learn. In terms of intermediate results, what our module will help you do is to identify the right themes for intermediate results. There's typically some work afterwards to refine and make them more measurable, the intermediate results, but that can typically be undertaken by a smaller group. So during the theory of change, you will name core elements like problems, goals, outcomes. What the module calls strategic approaches, you might typically might think of as actions, the things we're going to do. For each of those strategic approaches and those actions, it'll help you identify those really key assumptions implied in the logic of your theory of change, and then to create those IRs, those intermediate results that will help you validate those key logic leaps as we've discussed. So after you complete the theory of change, you can then really go through the process of ensuring that your intermediate results are measurable, trackable, and scientifically feasible. And we have developed a standalone tool for teams that have a theory of change, have intermediate results already, to help you in going through that refinement process. And during that, you can also think about picking targets for your intermediate results, as you saw illustrated in the earlier slides, if you don't have those already. So as I mentioned, just having your intermediate results coming out of the theory of change is only the starting point. You actually have to then set up that plan to actually gather the data and use them for adaptive management. And that is where our monitoring, evaluation, and learning, our MEL module, comes into its own. And as I emphasized already, this really is a critical module. It really is critical work for you to set yourselves up for success. So during the MEL module, you're actually going to pick a single intermediate result. And the reason for this is we want teams to build the muscle of how you take an intermediate result, strengthen it, and set up that monitoring plan. And then the team itself can readily go back and add additional intermediate results following that process. And the idea is that you're going to generate learning agenda questions about the linkages between activities, those key assumptions, and those intermediate results. So really figure out what are the right questions for you to be asking, what are the right data for you to be gathering to test those intermediate results and those underlying assumptions. So I want to wrap them with a few final thoughts here. One thing it really is just to emphasize that, the quality of your intermediate results is determined by the quality of your theory of change. And so, spending time to make sure you have a strong theory of change is going to be absolutely critical. We recognize that our teams are really, really busy. And that for most teams, the idea of going out and generating intermediate results for all of the strategies you might be engaged with at one point in time is more than you can manage. Yeah. So where possible, obviously honoring the guidance set by leadership, we do suggest that you focus on your highest priority work first. And that's the work where often it's been elevated through the portfolio management process. It's the work that you think is on track to have significant impact. As I mentioned already, quick reminder here again, quality of your intermediate results determined by the quality of your theory of change. And then, really, having those intermediate results, again, the value comes when you use them in the context of adaptive management. You follow that through and you use it to update these elements of your strategy, including your theory of change. So thank you so much for your time and attention. I hope this presentation has been useful. I do really encourage you to check out the Conservation by Design modules available through the Conservation by Design website, and wish you the best of luck with continuing to develop and adaptively manage your strategies. Thank you.